Welcome to Trending Tidbits. Today, we're going to be exploring some brain science stuff.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, like how motivation works and desire, and even some stuff about fear and disgust.
Wow. Sounds intense.
Yeah, it is. We've got all this great research, too, a bunch of neuroscience articles and a couple of Psychology Today pieces.
Nice. So are we going to pinpoint the pleasure center of the brain or something?
Well, we're definitely going to be asking that question.
Yeah.
And, is dopamine really the pleasure chemical?
Right.
And can you, flip fear and desire in the same part of the brain? Like a switch?
I'm hooked already. Let's get into it.
Okay, well, first let's talk about this study by Fowrai and his team back in 2008.
Okay.
So they were working with rats, and they found that if they stimulated this one specific area, they could trigger either a huge craving for food
Really?
or intense fear, all depending on how they stimulated.
Whoa. So they could just change the rat's whole motivation.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Right. But then it gets even crazier because when they blocked the dopamine in that same area,
Yeah.
it stopped both the eating and the fear behaviors.
So dopamine isn't just about pleasure then. It's
Definitely.
it's about wanting stuff in general, good or bad.
That's exactly what it looks like. It
Yeah.
kind of throws that whole pleasure chemical idea out the window.
But
It makes you think about addiction in a different way,
Right.
or even just regular everyday motivation,
yeah, for sure. Makes you think about those urges we all get.
Totally. So then if dopamine isn't giving us pleasure, what is?
Good question.
Well, there's this research from Berridge and Kringleback in 2015.
Okay.
They talk about these hedonic hotspots.
Hedonic hotspot.
Yeah, they're like tiny little pleasure amplifiers in your brain.
Wow.
Like when you bite into a piece of amazing chocolate,
Ooh, yeah.
those hotspots are firing away.
I can feel it now. But wait, didn't they also find that the brain area for wanting something is way bigger than the area for actually liking it?
You got it. So your brain can be super motivated to get something,
Yeah.
even if you don't end up really enjoying it that much.
Oh, that makes so much sense for addiction.
Right.
You can crave something without even liking it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's this Psychology Today article that talks about why we do stuff
Yeah.
that we know we don't want to do.
Yeah.
It talks about all these different wants battling it out in our brains without us even realizing it.
Like a tug of war.
Yeah. We might want to be healthy and eat salad, but then that chocolate cake is calling to us from the bakery.
Oh, man. Tell me about it.
Right. So that brings us to the whole power of cues thing.
Okay.
There's this article by Berridge from 2018 that really gets into it. And it actually connects to that Psychology Today piece about dieting.
Okay.
It's all about how what's around us, like our environment,
Yeah.
interacts with how we're feeling inside to make us crave things.
Oh, that's so true.
Right. It's like this thing called incentive salience.
Incentive salience.
Yeah, it's basically how much motivational power a cue has.
Okay, I see.
So that's why when you see a fast food commercial and you're already stressed and hungry,
Oh, yeah.
it's way more tempting than if you were relaxed and full.
100%. The same cue can be so different depending on how you're feeling.
Totally. So it's kind of like knowing your enemy.
Hmm.
If you know how cues work, you can start to plan ahead,
Right.
Avoid those tempting situations or think about it differently so you don't give in to the craving.
It's not about getting rid of those urges completely, but understanding them so you can deal with them.
Exactly. So we've got dopamine driving our motivation,
Okay.
hedonic hotspots giving us those little bursts of pleasure,
Yeah.
and cues messing with our cravings.
Uh-huh.
But what about fear and disgust?
Ooh, right. What about those?
Well, get this. This research from Farray's team in 2010
Okay.
showed that stimulating that same brain area we were just talking about with dopamine
Yeah.
could make the rats either want food like crazy or be totally terrified.
Wait a minute. So the same spot in the brain can flip between I want that and run for your life.
It's wild, right? But it shows you just how complex our brains are. It's not just a simple on-off switch.
Right.
It's like a whole musical keyboard.
Ooh, interesting.
Different inputs, different keys, and you get a different emotional melody.
I like that. But then how does the brain keep all those signals straight?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
How do we know whether to be scared or whether to be excited about something?
Exactly. It's like if you're playing a piano, how do you know which keys to hit to make the right song?
Totally. And it seems like our brains have some pretty amazing ways of sorting through all those signals and figuring out the right emotional response.
Yeah, based on what's going on around us, our past experiences and how we're feeling at that moment.
Right. It's like our brain is conducting this whole orchestra of neural activity to create the emotional music we experience.
Yeah. Wow. That's a beautiful way to put it. It makes you realize just how much is happening under the surface,
Totally. And it gets even more fascinating when we start to look at the connections between emotions that seem totally different,
Yeah.
like fear and disgust.
Oh, yeah, I'm curious about that. Like in that last study where they triggered both desire and fear in the same spot.
Right.
Makes you wonder what other surprises are out there.
For sure.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this fear and disgust connection.
Well, this limbic keyboard idea we were talking about,
Uh,
it suggests that different emotions might be way more connected than we think. Like, think about it. We use the same words for fear and disgust sometimes. You know?
Like when you see a spider and you're like, that's disgusting.
Exactly. Or a snake or something.
You're right. I never thought about it like that.
And there's research from Ho and Barrage in 2014 that showed
Okay.
when they did certain things to that limbic keyboard area in rats, it made both their fear and disgust responses stronger.
So it's like hitting two keys at once on the piano and getting a chord instead of just one note.
Exactly. So fear and disgust might be like intertwined at a brain level.
That's crazy.
It really is. And it opens up all these new questions about how they work together,
Totally. This is making me rethink all those times I've said something is disgusting. Like maybe I was secretly terrified the whole time.
Maybe so. Our brains are so complex.
They really are.
And the way we experience emotions is probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Wow. This is all so fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. But before we go too deep,
Yeah.
I want to bring it back to everyday life. Like, what are some things our listeners can take away from all this?
That's a good point. I think one of the biggest takeaways is that, like, what's around us and how we're feeling inside,
Yeah.
they play a huge role in what we crave and how we feel. And if we get that, then we can start making better choices,
Like we can avoid those situations that trigger bad cravings.
Right. Or we can learn to deal with those urges in a healthier way.
So it's not about like getting rid of all those primal urges completely.
Yeah. No.
It's about understanding how they work and learning to work with them.
Exactly. Like it's a game and we can get better at playing it.
I like that. So we can learn to recognize those triggers, think about things differently,
Right.
and make choices that are good for us in the long run.
Exactly. It's empowering to realize we have more control than we think.
It really is.
Yeah.
But what about people who are dealing with more serious stuff like addiction or depression?
Yeah, that's a good question.
How does all this apply to them?
Well, one of the coolest things about this research is that it's helping us understand those conditions better.
Really?
Like take depression, for example. One of the big things with depression is something called anhedonia.
Anhedonia.
Yeah, it's like when you lose the ability to enjoy things.
So people with depression don't find things as pleasurable anymore.
Well, that's one way to think about it. But this research on wanting and liking suggests that sometimes depression is more about a lack of wanting rather than liking.
So it's not that they don't enjoy things anymore.
Right.
It's that they don't have the motivation to go after them in the first place.
Exactly. So it's not just about making them feel happier. It's about rekindling that spark of motivation.
So like making things feel worth pursuing again.
Yes. And this could lead to new treatments that focus on that, you know?
That's really hopeful. It's like we're seeing mental health in a whole new way.
I agree. And it's not just depression. We're using these ideas to study anxiety, schizophrenia, OCD, all sorts of things.
Wow.
It's really revolutionizing how we understand the brain and opening up all these new possibilities for treatment.
It's amazing to think about all the progress being made in understanding the brain.
It really is.
And how it shapes our emotions and our actions.
Yeah. But as we learn more, we also have to remember the ethical side of things,
Right. Like we're gaining all this knowledge about motivation and desire.
Exactly.
And we need to be careful about how it's used.
For sure. Like think about advertising. As we learn more about how cues work and how they make us crave things, advertisers could use that to become even better at manipulating us.
Right. Like making us want things we don't need.
Exactly. So we need to be smart about it and have some ethical guidelines in place.
That's like a double-edged sword. This knowledge can help us make good choices, but it can also be used to take advantage of us.
Exactly. That's why critical thinking and media literacy are so important. We need to be aware of the forces that are trying to influence us.
And make our own choices about what we let affect our decisions.
I agree. It's a reminder that knowledge is power, but it's up to us to use it responsibly.
Well said.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier.
Okay.
The idea that fear and disgust might be connected in the brain.
Wow, right.
I know it sounds weird, but it actually makes sense when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like both fear and disgust are about protecting ourselves.
Ah.
Fear helps us avoid danger and disgust helps us avoid things that could make us sick.
So they both have the same goal, even though they feel different.
Exactly. And maybe those shared roots in self-preservation are reflected in how our brains process them.
That's fascinating.
There's still a lot we don't know, but it's a really cool area of research.
It is. It could teach us so much about the evolution of human emotions.
It's incredible to think that fear and disgust might share some of the same brain pathways.
Yeah.
That really shows how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, and how much we still have to learn.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our trending tidbits for today. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about how our environment, our feelings, and even our evolution shape our desires and emotions.
Right.
But with all those influences, how much control do we really have over our own minds?
Wow. That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And I don't think there's an easy answer.
No, probably not.
It's probably more about finding a balance.
Yeah.
Recognizing those forces that are influencing us, but also embracing our ability to make choices and direct our own lives.
Exactly. It's a dance between nature and nurture, between our biology and our willpower.
And the more we understand about how our brains work,
Yeah.
the better we can become at leading that dance.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of motivation, desire, fear, and disgust.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep exploring those amazing brains of yours.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Yeah, it's like, how do we know if we should run away from something or like be excited about it?
It's like our brains have this super sophisticated system for sorting through all those signals and like
Right.
figuring out how we should feel.
Yeah, like what's the right emotion for this situation? Based on like what's happening around us and our
Right.
past experiences and just how we're feeling right now.
It's like our brain is this conductor leading a whole orchestra of neural activity
Oh.
to create the emotional music that we experience.
Wow, that's a beautiful way to put it. It really makes you think about all the stuff that's happening in our brains that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, and it gets even more interesting when you start looking at the connections between emotions that seem totally different,
Oh, yeah.
like fear and disgust.
Okay.
Like in that study we were just talking about where they could trigger desire and fear
Mm-hmm.
in the same brain area.
Makes you wonder what other connections are hiding in there.
Yeah, totally. So tell me more about this fear and disgust thing.
Well, this limbic keyboard idea we were talking about,
Yeah.
it kind of suggests that different emotions might be way more connected than we realize.
Okay.
Like, think about the words we use sometimes. We'll say, that's disgusting, when we see something scary,
Ooh, yeah, that's true.
like a spider or a snake.
Right. I never thought of it that way.
There's this research from Ho and Barrage in 2014.
Okay.
They showed that when they manipulated that limbic keyboard area in rats,
Yeah.
it made both their fear and disgust reactions stronger.
So it's like they were hitting two keys on a piano at the same time and getting a chord.
Exactly, instead of just one note.
Yeah. So fear and disgust could be like intertwined at the level of our brains.
It's pretty mind-blowing, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder like how many other emotions are connected in ways we don't even realize.
It definitely opens up a whole new way of thinking about emotions.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's making me rethink all those times I've said something is disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe deep down I was actually scared.
Maybe so. Our brains are seriously complex.
They really are.
Yeah.
It seems like the way we experience emotions consciously is probably just a tiny part of the whole picture.
Yeah, there's probably a lot going on beneath the surface that we're not even aware of.
Wow, this is all so fascinating. I feel like we could talk about this forever, but
Yeah.
before we get too carried away, I want to bring it back down to earth for a minute.
Okay.
Like, what are some practical takeaways our listeners can get from all this?
That's a good point. I think one of the biggest things is that our environment and our internal state, they play a huge role in how we feel
Right.
and what we want. And if we understand that, we can start making more conscious choices.
Like avoiding those situations that trigger cravings.
Exactly. Or learning how to manage those urges in a healthy way.
So it's not about trying to eliminate all those basic urges completely.
No.
It's about understanding them and learning to work with them.
It's like we're playing a game and we can learn to play it better.
I like that. So
Yeah.
we can recognize those triggers and reframe our thinking
Yeah.
and ultimately make choices that are good for us in the long run.
Exactly. It's really empowering to realize that we have more control than we think.
It really is.
Yeah.
But what about people who are struggling with more serious issues,
Yeah.
like addiction or depression? How does all this apply to them?
Well, one of the most exciting things about this research is that it's helping us understand those conditions better.
Really?
Yeah, like take depression, for example.
Yeah.
A big part of depression is this thing called anhedonia.
Anhedonia.
It's basically the inability to experience pleasure.
So it's like they don't enjoy things anymore.
Well, that's one way to look at it. But this research on wanting and liking,
Yeah.
it suggests that sometimes depression is more about a lack of wanting rather than liking.
Oh, so it's not that they don't enjoy things anymore.
Right.
It's that they just don't have the motivation to go after them.
Exactly. So the goal isn't just to make them feel happier,
Yeah.
it's to reignite that motivational spark.
Like making those pleasurable things feel worth pursuing again.
Yes. And this is leading to new approaches to treatment that focus on that.
That's really hopeful. It's like we're understanding mental health in a whole new way.
Definitely. And it's not just depression either. We're using these same ideas to study anxiety, schizophrenia, OCD,
Wow.
all sorts of things. It's
Yeah.
really revolutionizing how we think about the brain.
And it's giving us all these new possibilities for treatment.
Absolutely. It's a really exciting time to be studying the brain.
Yeah, it really is exciting. So we've made all this progress in understanding the brain, but
Right.
we also have to think about like the ethics of it all, you know?
Oh, absolutely. As we learn more about how our brains work, especially when it comes to things like motivation and desire,
Right.
we have to be really careful about how that knowledge is used.
Yeah, like it could be used for good or for bad.
Exactly. Like imagine what could happen with advertising.
Oh, yeah.
If they figure out exactly how to trigger our cravings.
It could make us want all kinds of stuff that we don't actually need.
Right. So we need to be aware of that and maybe come up with some rules to make sure this knowledge is used ethically.
It's like we have this powerful tool now,
Yeah.
and we have to make sure we use it responsibly.
Exactly. Like we need to be able to think critically and understand how media is trying to influence us.
So we can make our own choices about what we really want.
I couldn't agree more. It's a good reminder that knowledge is power, but it's up to us to use that power for good.
Well said. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
The idea that fear and disgust might actually be connected in the brain.
Oh.
I know it sounds strange, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like they're both about protecting ourselves.
Mhm.
Fear helps us avoid danger, and disgust keeps us away from things that could make us sick.
So they both serve the same purpose, even though they feel totally different.
Exactly. And maybe that's why they seem to be linked in our brains.
That's a really cool way to think about it.
There's still a lot we don't know for
Yeah.
sure, but it's definitely a fascinating area of research.
It is. It could teach us a lot about how human emotions evolved.
It's amazing to think that emotions as different as fear and disgust might actually share some of the same pathways in our brains,
Yeah, it really shows how complex and interconnected everything is.
and how much we still have to learn.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our deep dive for today, but
Oh.
I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about how our environment, our internal states, even our evolutionary history shape our desires and emotions. But with all those influences, how much control do we really have over our own minds?
That's a great question, and a really tough one.
It is. I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah, it's probably more about finding that balance
Mhm.
between recognizing those forces that are influencing us
Right.
and also embracing our ability to make conscious choices and direct our own lives.
Exactly. It's this constant dance between nature and nurture, our biology and our willpower.
And the more we learn about how our brains work,
Yeah.
the better we become at leading that dance.
Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of motivation, desire, fear, and disgust.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring those fascinating brains of yours.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.